So let me introduce Pratik. Pratik is a former software engineer turned journalist and filmmaker. He's a Dalit activist and vegan, and he's been vocal about animal rights issues for the last 8 years. Luke, could you spotlight Pratik, please? The title of today's workshop is Veganism in India, understanding how veganism functions in India and how it's being used as a tool to further marginalized communities and what we can do to stop this. So Pratik will talk about the history of the caste system and anti-caste movement in Indian subcontinent, how Savarna Brahmin communities try to use veganism as a tool to oppress communities in the country. Lastly, he will talk about what we can do to stop this and work on the anti-caste and animal rights movement together. So please all welcome Pratik. Over to you, Pratik.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction, Ellie. And am I audible? Am I properly audible to everyone?
Yes.
So let's start with the history. I mean, I'll start with my sharing with my PPT.
Thank you.
Yeah. So hi everyone. So this is Pratik. I am currently currently residing in Mumbai, India. I'm originally from a very small town of India. It's called Basti. It's in Uttar Pradesh. It's a district of the state called Uttar Pradesh. So here I'll be talking about the first slide talk. No, just stay the back. So veganism in India. So I gave these three little sort of say title: a road to liberation, an oppressive tool, or a challenge to the system. So one way it is a road to liberation, because the way we as in Dalit community people, Dalit vegans and Bahujan vegans, the way we see it, the veganism, it counters both the caste system as well as the animal, and as well as promotes the animal rights together. Like we both this road of liberation, we combine both the things, the anti-caste movement as well, and also the animal rights movement. It combines both, and they sort of complement each other, and they help each other. So that way is a road to liberation in veganism in India. The second one is an oppressive tool. Obviously, the people from the higher caste and higher class people who are completely detached from the ground realities of India, and they basically just follow whatever is happening in the West or in the European countries, and how they see the animals and how they treat the animals. Basically, they take just that and they try to apply it here without even understanding the relationship between the people of marginalized people of India and the animals, marginal communities, marginal animal communities. So that way they are actually denying the access to people. I'll be talking about this in the later session. So that's where it's a oppressive tool, and the challenge to system again is the same. When we combine both the power of anti-caste movement and animal rights movement, it actually challenges the system, and the system is Brahminical. So can we move to the next slide? So here I'll start with the history of the casteism in India, and also the anti-caste movement. So the very so the very first thing that we see here is Brahmanism. So Brahmanism is actually a system that actually invented the caste system in not just in India but also the entire subcontinent, where it contains every like all the countries of the Indian subcontinent, countries like Pakistan, countries like Nepal, countries like Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. All of these countries, subcontinent countries, they have this system called caste system, and it was invented by Brahmins of that time, of very earlier age. And it's very debatable to say when it started and who started it, but it goes to the Vedic era. So it goes around like 3,500 years back, where we had this Vedic era, where people from a certain region, they invented this system, of very rigid system of caste. Brahminism is actually, it affects everybody. It's a system not just defined for humans but also for animals, for everything it defines. So that's that way, in that era it was created. And so there are like 4 divisions in the caste system. So Brahmin come on top, and then Kshatriyas come, and then Shudras come, Vaishyas come, then come Shudras, and there is another category who are Ati Shudras, who are not even considered in the system. So why we call it Brahminism is because first of all, the Brahmins had invented it, and second of all, that Brahmins are the people who get benefits, who get the benefit most, who benefit the most from this system. And also this system is very similar to white supremacy, but it actually goes ahead of white supremacy, because they not only just dependent on the race. Here they don't just consider race, but they consider everything. So here in Brahminical system, Brahmin people are like above everybody, like even in the race and everything. So when white people come from America and Europe, European countries, here they try to convert into Hinduism. So there they, even the Brahmin, they consider themselves above, like they consider themselves the most superior of all. They like next to the gods. Like even in very places they have said that they are the voice of the gods. So whatever they say becomes the rule of the land. So that's why we call it Brahminism. And it not just affects the human people, it affects everything. So the system actually has defined everything like what kind of music which community of people should listen what kind of music, and which community of people should do this kind of dance, which community of people should eat what kind of food, which community of people do this kind of work. I mean, the first perception of people they have when they hear about the caste system and this whole thing, they think that it's a division based on occupation, but it's not just an occupation thing. Even if suppose you're working as a manager, so basically anything that has to do with business, like banking, managing everything, selling and everything, that comes under the Vaishya's caste. But if you're not doing that job, you're doing something else, your caste won't change, your caste will remain the same. So that occupation does not really affect here. And here when we say when we say this affects everything, so like a Dalit person is not allowed to even learn Indian classical music. He's not allowed to even touch the instruments or any kind of musical instrument, any kind of thing that they do. Even though many of the Dalit communities, they do make that instrument, and they give that instrument to the people, to Brahmin people to play, because those instrument contains skin, animal skin, all sort of things like that. So this way it affects. It also affects women regardless of any caste. So basically a woman, when she's born, she's always a Shudra. Basically she doesn't have any caste unless she is married to someone. So when she marries a Brahmin, she becomes a Brahmin. When she marries a Kshatriya, she becomes a Kshatriya. But here is a catch again. When a girl in a Brahmin community, she is born, so they are not allowed to marry any other people from any other caste, because then that will break the caste system, because a person from one caste will try to there will be intercaste, and they won't be it won't be pure or anything. So I'll talk about purity in the next slide. And then social order, basically it's again is the same thing, the social order what we're talking. Just go back, I'll have to explain the Dalit veganism. So thank you. So last part of this slide is about Dalit veganism. So Dalit vegans as of now, they are probably outcast in our own anti-caste movement as well, and also in the main community as well. What we do is we are basically anti-caste. We against all this oppressive system that we already have, that is made for humans. But we also see how this Brahminism system, it affects animals as well, and also use animals as a tool to control the caste. So for example, we all know how people in India, they praise cows and how holy, how sacred they consider cows. But cow is only holy and sacred only as long as they are alive. The moment they are dead, they become impure. And when they go dead and become impure, then only people from marginalized community, Dalit community, they come and they take that cow away, and then they take their skin, and then they take their flesh, they take their horns and make things out of it, like lots of fancy things, lot of sacred things. They make cow skins and everything. So they make, again, the musical instruments they make out of cow skin, and they make a lot of bags and products from that. And then they give it back to the Brahmin people. So when the cow is alive, she's pure, and we are not allowed to touch them, we are not allowed to go near them. But when she's dead, we are called, and we are called to take them away, and we are called to take their skins out and everything. And the next thing is, again, horses, for example. We are not allowed to ride horses, but they are allowed to, like Kshatriyas are allowed to ride horses, Kshatriyas are allowed to own horses. And again, when we look at from the veganism perspective, riding horse again is speciesist, and it's again it's very oppressive system. Like, again, when we are like, they're using horse as a tool to oppress us. So here the horse as a community is also getting oppressed, and through them we are also getting oppressed. So these both connections together, when we combine, when we say that we won't ride horses, but we also won't let you ride horses because it's not right, because you're taking away their right and you using them as a tool to take away our rights as well. So that's why we combine Dalit veganism. That's why it becomes very powerful tool. And why our community, anti-caste community, Dalit community are considers us as outcast, because lot of food and lot of clothing and lot of what do you say, occupations that was actually forced on us through thousands of centuries, it has now become the only skill many people of the community know. And when we speak about ditching leather, when we speak about ditching all sort of meat products and all sort of things like that, so they do not have anywhere else to go, they do not know any skills. And it's not like they do not have they do not want to change, they do not want to go into other sections. Is that they're not allowed to do any other job, they're not allowed into space, any other spaces. They're not allowed, even if they're allowed, they're not provided resources, because they're dirt poor. Not just first generation, it's like thousands of generation we have been poor, and we don't have any means to reallocate ourselves or rehabilitate ourselves into other forms of occupations or other forms of living. So that's why they consider us as a spokesperson of Brahmins or spokespersons of higher caste people. So that's why we are outcast from both the communities. So we can move to next slide. Yeah, so this whole system of this whole Brahminism system, it works on the notion of purity. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I mean, legal system, it does affect legal system. I'll explain how. Just remind me at the end. So this whole system works on the purity notion. So you must have, I think most of the people here, or I think everybody here will know about how Nazism was based on purity, racial purity. That, oh, we are the pure race, we are the superior race. And that mentality, that philosophy, that thinking is directly extracted from the Hindu's text. So there is this researcher, I don't know, I've not written the name here, but Adori Trotsky, something like that, there's a name. So she has done a very thorough research on how Hinduism how Hinduism basically functions, and how the racial connotations is there, and how Nazism was influenced by Hinduism. So that notion of purity basically drives everything. Everything has to be pure, everything has to be clean, everything has to be very untouched from each other. So we are considered impure because, again, we deal with a lot of dirt, we deal with a lot of things that it was actually forced upon us, like how the system I have explained before. So all the lower forms of jobs that is there, like all cleaning roads, or cleaning gutters, or tannery work at the bottom, where you have to take off the skin and you have to deal with all the kinds of toxic waste and everything that is forced upon us, and that's we have to do. So that's why we are considered impure. And because we are considered impure, so we are not allowed to we are not allowed to stay in the city, we are not allowed to come out in the open in the morning. This is, I'm talking about the like earlier times, not now. I mean, it is still practiced in many parts of India, but not that intense. The intensity of that practice is not that there. A lot of people are discriminated against. They are not, we are not allowed to enter in any temples, we're not allowed to go into like public forums. I mean, where they are like dominant caste and everything. So in that way we are considered impure. Women are considered impure because, first of all, the most critical thing of why they are considered impure is because of the menstrual cycle that women have, and because they bleed a certain time of the month, and so they are considered dirty, they're considered impure, and they're not allowed to go many places, like again in temples and things like that. Also, uh, controlling women controlling women in the system is actually controlling the system, because they give birth to people, and when you control the womb, you control the entire system. That's the philosophy of this whole Brahmanism. So there is this book called Manusmriti. It's a religious text of Hinduism, and it has actually step-by-step guidance of how a woman should be, and what should woman do, and how she should live, and what kind of woman is considered as an ideal woman, what kind of woman is considered a bad woman, or things like that. They have even gone to a details like how she should walk, and what kind of what she should talk about, how she should treat her uh, younger siblings, elder siblings, everything. They have gone through like points by points in that. And this Manusmriti is not written right now. I mean, not written in this day and age. It was written around 3500 years ago, and many people are still like hardcore Hindu people, they still follow that. They it is not just sexist, it's not just casteist, but it's also ableist, because they do not consider a woman who is like, who cannot walk properly, or who has some sort of disability in her body, that is not like, she's not an ideal, so she should be discarded, like she should be banned from the society. It's written in the Manusmriti, like it's like that. And so that's why they are considered impure, like they're not considered pure, like in this sense. And they also, in all the festivals and all the, when we praise gods and everything, we see a lot of images of women doing puja, and women praying, and women doing meditation, but ideally they are not allowed. They are not allowed to become the priest, they are not allowed to become any sort of religious thing, because again they are like bleed and all sort of things like that. So all because of that. And animals are not the center of veganism here in India. And obviously, because here in India, veganism, when we talk about, it's not about the animals, it's actually about the people, the higher caste people. They do it for the purity perspective. They say that, okay, I come from this community, I do not eat animals, I do not eat meat, because I am pure. If I eat animals, or if I eat anything or I have or consume any animal product, I'll become impure, and my religion will be uh, it will be dissolved, like there'll be a sin, some I mean, there is a proper word in Hindi, but in English it's proper, probably sin, like they will be considered bad for their religion. So again, absence of animals, so there is no animal in the veganism in India when you're talking about. So we can move on to next slide. So speciesism in Hinduism, this is the core form of this is the core of Hinduism. Like any god you see, any god, there are like probably, how they say, 33 million gods in Hinduism, and every god in Hinduism rides some sort of animal, some sort of bird. I don't know if like, if somebody from hardcore Hindu sect sees my PPT, this form of PPT, I think I'll be I'll be in real danger, because I'm really literally attacking them at this point of time. So the speciesism is actually the core form of Hinduism. You see any god, they're like 33 crore god, something around 33 million. Everybody is riding some sort of animal. They are riding some sort of animals, or a bird, or insect, or anything. So obviously riding animals is speciesism. It's as simple as that. If you like, again, and if you're god, if you're like so higher being, if you're like so superior, you have so much power, why do you ride animals? Like, you can just fly away, you can just snap your fingers and you can just reach anywhere in the part of the world, right? So why would you want to ride an animal to it doesn't make sense. The only argument that they give is that these people are the gods ride these animals because these animals are sacred, these animals are pure, and these animals are very holy, and this way we will actually worship animals, this way we will actually give them value and will, you know, treat them nicely. But it's not about niceness, it's not about treating them nicely. Like it's basically about rights. You're using animals for your own self, for your own ego, for your own proudness, for your own benefit. Because if you want to treat an animal nicely, you give them their right, you give them their space, right? Why would you want to catch a peacock from a jungle and you bring it into an ashram, and then you start to pray? You're taking that peacock from their natural habitat, from a jungle, and you're bringing them into an ashram, basically like a prison, and then you're worshiping them. You know, it's like it's a very, I find it personally very disgusting that you bring somebody. It's like a torture, sadism sort of, say, that you bring someone in, you keep them in a prison, and then you worship. You're basically taking away all of their freedom, they're taking away everything from them, and you're basically deciding also when they should eat, when they should uh, go out, when they should breed. Everything you're deciding, and you're telling them that you know they are gods. Basically how they do with cows as well. They consider cow as, in India, consider cow as mother, but then we impregnate them, we forcefully impregnate them, we take out their milk, and we do all sort of things with them, and then we call them a mother. So it's very twisted. And also because of this, they also maintain the hierarchy, because again, gods are riding these animals. So if gods are riding these animals, so they are closer to god, and closer to god, and next to god in the system are Brahmins. So they are allowed to be around those animals, they are allowed to be near those animals, but we are not allowed to be anywhere there, anywhere near them. And that's how they use animals against us, to again discriminate against us. And there are lots and lots of incidents in India happening even in 2021, as if it was like 1000 years ago, where they use animals as, like, you know, they'll accuse us of using cow meat, eating cow meat, or killing a peacock, or killing some sort of animals, and then they'll trash us, or then they'll try to take it everything away from us, and sort of things like that. There are a lot of incidents that has happened. And so again, the speciesism is a supremacist ideology. Again, I've basically explained this. And veganism, so this way veganism works as a supremacist ideology, because you're one way you're telling that, okay, these animals are sacred, and these animals we should worship these animals, and you know, this our text talks about these things, our holy text talks about these things. So these animals are pure, and these animals are sacred, and gods are riding these animals. But then again, they use that as a tool to again oppress us. Many of the people in the Dalit communities, they do not want to do much of the dirty things that we are doing, like taking the flesh out of the cows, or all other animals, or when the horse is dead, their skin and their hair and everything that we have to do. Many of them, that they do not have any other occupation, because they were forced thousands of years ago, and then that forced occupation that kept on generational, and it kept on going. And now today we know no other job but only that. A lot of people are trying to move out, a lot of people have struggled a lot, like going through all sort of some forms of discrimination, and they have pulled themselves up. But then it's very limited, like only 5 to 7% of the people so far have been able to do that. But rest of the people, they are like literally dependent on it, so they have no other option but to continue that job. And then you come from a very higher place, and then you come tell us that no, you should not do this job because you're doing that animal thing, and you're killing that animal and doing all sort of things like that. So it obviously becomes a supremacist ideology, right? You're using that animals as a tool to oppress it again. And the products also that we make, it doesn't remain with us, it goes back again to the Brahmins. So they don't say them to stop using that, to tell them to stop using that, or to challenge them. They do challenge, but not in that sense the way they challenge us. So this way it works as a supremacist ideology. So can we move to next slide? So here, so this is the caste system that is there. So untouchables, basically the Atishudras that I talked about. So this is also the purity of the caste goes higher as you move up to the pyramid, and the impurity increases as you move the bottom of the pyramid, and purity increases at the top. So Brahmin people are obviously at the top. Then come the Kshatriyas. So Kshatriyas basically rulers and warriors, they are the one. And Vaishyas, the merchant, the traders, the bank managers, everything that has to do with business considered as Vaishyas. So only those people are allowed to do that kind of business and everything. And Shudras are basically peasants that we say, farmers, laborers, daily wage workers, and everyone. And below them comes untouchables, the Atishudras, the tribal people, all the indigenous people of the mainland. I'm saying mainland India, I'm saying because we have the 7 states on the northeastern part of India, and Kashmir and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and all these areas, nearby islands that we have. So they are not the part of the mainland. So I mean, they are not part of the mainland. Their people, the relationship of caste and relationship of indigenous people is something a little different than what we see in the mainland. So, and here on the side, I have explained the pyramid of like food chain pyramid. This is basically food chain pyramid I have taken, but I have explained how different categories of different section of animals are only allowed to have different part of the. I'll explain. I'm explaining. So, like Brahmins, they are allowed to have cows. They are allowed to have the sacred animals, horses, and peacocks, and some bunch of animals that they consider sacred, and only they are allowed to touch them, only they are allowed to go near them or take care of them or reap the benefits out of those animals. And Kshatriyas, they have like horses and mules and camels and all sort of things like that. Only they are allowed, we are not allowed. And Vaishyas, again, they have like donkeys and different animals. And Shudras, buffaloes and bulls, and basically anything to do with farming, those animals. So they hold that. And Atishudras, we untouchable, we are actually don't allow to have any animals or any control over any animals. Basically, we are left outside the system, and also outside anything like anything that is not considered sacred, anything that is not considered pure. Basically, we are left with that. So it comes like chicken and pigs and all sort of animals that are considered dirty. That's how the system was, that's how the things is there. Now obviously taking care of cows and taking care of horses, taking care of animals, people from marginalized communities such as Shudras and untouchables, they are called upon to clean their feces, to clean their dirts, and to give them bath, to wash them, everything, to take care of them basically. But the owner would be that particular caste. For cows it will be Brahmin, for horses it will be Kshatriya, like that. So in that way it is there. So we can move to next slide. So a savanna was, so this is a term that I coined. So it's basically a universe. So I explain, I've written it here. So it's a universe, just like a like a Marvel universe or cinematic universe, is actually made by the Savanna people, and Savanna people, and for the Savanna people, and by the Savanna people. So Savanna people is actually before I explain Savanna was, so Savanna is basically the people of higher caste and higher caste. Here in India, we have just like class, we have also caste system that we have explained. So higher caste people basically have more power and more privilege and more wealth and everything, and they control basically everything. And us Savanna people are people from marginalized communities. We call them Bahujans, we call them Dalits, we call them Adivasis. There are different communities, indigenous people. So we are marginalized communities, and the dominant communities are Savarna people. So here in this here in this Savarna verse, so everything here functions and regulars. The only thing here in this universe is that it's real, and it functions like a real universe with its rules, regulations, cultures, etc. It's a very white and west worshipping universe that is created by and for the Savarna people. So all of us other people, we need to follow these rules in order to get anything in life, like a good career, or like a good education, money, friendship, love, or basically just to exist. If we talk about our rights, if we talk about anything that we want to do in our life, if we talk about our struggles or our daily life, then basically we are just outcasted. We'll just say, okay, people would say, what is he talking about? And from food that we eat, from food that we eat to the media that we consume, the heroes that we see on the television, the politicians, the Instagram influencers, what is good for friendship, what is good for dating, what is good for what is considered cool, what is not considered cool, the music, the dance, the news anchors, the stand-up comedy that we see, the everything is decided from the comfort of a Savarna. So a Savarna person can come and make a casteist joke in the media, and everybody will like it, everybody will laugh at it without even considering, and without even thinking for a second that, oh, we just abused the community in the country. So a lot of people have made a casteist joke, a lot of people have made sexist joke. An incident I'll talk about, a very recent incident that happened, Veer Das. You can search about him. Veer Das is a stand-up comedian, and he was talking about the two India that we see now. So currently India is is dominated by a very right-wing party, and they are very authoritative and they are very conservative. So a lot of liberal people in India, they are not feeling comfortable about it. So Vedas come from a upper caste liberal society, upper caste liberal area space. So he was explaining there are two Indias where one is allowed to have all sort of religion freedom, and another one is not allowed to have religious freedom and things like that. And he was talking about very liberal sense of everything. But then he was the one who made a very bad joke about a Dalit woman leader. He called her that she looks like a man and she talks like a penguin and she walks like an elephant, things like that. He made a joke on her. Like literally, it was not just sexist, but also very casteist and also very bad. So these are the people who consider themselves liberal, and these are the people who consider themselves open-minded, progressive, and they are the one coming and making jokes on us, on people, our own leader who represent us. So this is one example of how Savarnaverse is working. So everything is decided from the comfort of a Savarna mind space, and this becomes acceptable norm in this universe. So you have to show certain kind of friendship standards of a Savarnaverse. People are a lot of people are aware about this, but they don't talk about it because Savarna people do not talk about it. They are the one who control media. They are the one who control everything. So, and caste doesn't affect them. So when caste doesn't affect them, so they won't speak about caste because it doesn't affect them. So why would they speak about it? So you have to show certain kind of friendship standards, certain level. If you do not come to that, so is there a way I can answer these questions at the end?
Yes, we can come back to them at the very end.
Okay. Yeah, so please, you can send the questions in chat because it just pops up and I get distracted.
Don't worry, I'm collecting them as we go, Pratik.
Okay, fine. So you have to show like certain kind of friendship standard and certain level of, Savarna level of standard, because our community, we have a different way of showing friendship. We have a different way of showing our love, showing our affection to our people, and that is vastly different from Savarna people, and their friendship standard, their way of showing affection is very much affected by the West and West media, and how European friendship standard and all sort of things like that. And everything here is affected. Also, the one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, this limitation of food that we talked about, that only certain people are allowed to have certain kind of foods. This has affected us generationally. So we lacked nutritional foods, we lacked nutritional vegetables and everything, and that has affected. There is a research that was done recently by Ashoka University, which showed that there is a stunted growth in Dalit children. So the gap of height between a Savarna kid and a Dalit kid was about 5 to 7 centimeters. And they were not just the height, but also the weight, and also the malnutrition gap was between them. And this does not just not is limited to that stunted growth. It has affected a lot. When you lack nutrition, when the growth affects you, it affects you a lot. Like it affects your mental ability, it affects your it affects your participation in sports, it affects how you do, how well you do in studies, how well you are perceived in the society, and everything. So obviously when your growth gets stunted, you remain very you remain short in height, you remain malnutrition, everything. And but the standard, how the society has set the standard of beauty, how the standard of how the society has set the standard of merit in our country, it sort of comes down as a very heavy thing, and it does not affect the height and everything. It affects our social being, it affects us in every single day, every single way it affects us. And at the end of the day, people just make the conclusion, oh, he or she was not good enough for this career, or he or she was not good enough for this job, or he or she is not good enough, they're not good looking, or they do not have good height and everything. But where it comes from, where does it come from, how it is, how, what made us that way, what has affected us in that manner? It's the lack of access to the nutrition, it's the lack of access to the resources, it is the lack of access to the support that we could get from the government, from the people who have more privilege and everything. So that is one that is the thing. And this Savarna bus also creates an invisible segregation line. So now the condition is not that bad. Like a lot of people can hang out with each other, a lot of people can meet, and a lot of people can do a lot of stuff. But then still this invisible line of segregation is there. Like this Bahujan people is basically considered everybody, Dalit and Adivasi and all sort of caste marginalized communities. So we Bahujan people can never cross this invisible line, because then we step into the comfort zone and make Savarna people uncomfortable. We are good enough to be associated with, but not good enough to be close friends with. And we are good enough to be entertainers and good enough to be just get the knowledge, but we are not good enough to get close with, or not for anything else. And in this Savarna bus, Dalit, Bahujan and Adivasi men are demonized. So basically how in the early 1900s, how black people, African American people in America were looked upon as very demonized, so thieves and thugs, and they look down, they look in a bad they look at white women in a bad way, and all sort of things like that. Basically how we are treated as, and and we are considered demonized, and we are considered unattractive. And while women of our community, they are over sexualized, objectified, and treated as commodities for Savarna people. So I'll give one example here. In Bollywood, there is this term famous, Banjara. So a lot of people, lot of movies, you'll see a hero from a protagonist from a very urban space. He goes into the village, and then he finds this Banjara girl, and then he falls in love with that Banjara girl. Banjara is basically a community of Adivasi people, and community of some Banjara communities come into Dalit, some Banjara communities come into Adivasis, indigenous society communities. So this hero goes from an urban space and goes into village, and then he sees this beautiful Banjara girl, and then he falls in love with her, and then does all sort of things, and then comes back without marrying her, and then he leaves her like that. And then this is one example, and another example, there are a lot of item songs in Bollywood. So item songs is basically where uh, a, a female protagonist, there is a dancer, and she performs a sort of sexualized dance where she is objectified, and the clothes that they wear, the clothes that women wear in that song, they actually comes from Banjara communities and Adivasi communities, the women that though they wear that clothes. So that it comes from there. So this way how women in India, and nobody objects it. Like obviously we do, for people from our community we do, and obviously Bahujan people do, a lot of our community does. But for Savarna people, it's just another form of dance. It's just another form of entertainment, and they are getting objectified women and all sort of things like that happening. And basically for them it's just an entertainment. So that's how they sexualize, over sexualize our over sexualized movement from our community. And yeah, objectified treated as community for Savarna people. So it's an invisible form of untouchability. Like a lot of people, from a lot of people you'll hear, oh, we don't follow untouchability now in India, and this untouchability doesn't exist. Even the progressive people, they say this untouchability doesn't exist, but then they practice it in a way that you will feel, okay, this is not untouchability, but you'll see that it's an untouchability. Because okay, you'll come to me to know about caste system, will come to me to know about all sort of things that is happening, but then you'll just keep me at a distance. You'll just keep me at a distance. Okay, I should not get close to this person because he comes from this caste. And just they'll maintain a distance. They won't shake hands, they won't do all sort of things like that. They'll just maintain the distance. So it's a form of invisible untouchability that is happening. And again, we become the subjects of their theses, we become the subject of their props, I mean talk shows, we become the sources for their social credits. Basically, if anybody wants to become a progressive in India, they will talk about caste, they will talk about how gender in caste affects and all sort of relation they will talk about, but they will never give us a space to talk about. They will never provide us the space to express ourselves. And we have been speaking about caste ever since the caste system has existed, but then they don't want to, they want to take the attention from there, and they want to keep the attention on them all the time. So they do not want that. So they talk about us, but they do not let us talk about us. That's what I'm saying. So they like basically memorize our pain and struggle, and they wear it like a medal. They see how we struggle, they see how we do everything, how we're struggling. They memorize, they by heart, they make all sort of theory, and they do all sort of research, and then they get their medals and or everything, and they just wear it like some sort of pride thing. So that's how the Savarna works. So that we can go to next slide. So Dalit veganism, as I explained in the beginning, that's how it works. It's very strong. It not just it's not just an anti-caste movement, but also anti-species. So basically, Hinduism is the part of all of this thing, anti-caste movement. Like if Hinduism exists, the caste system exists. If Hinduism doesn't exist, caste system won't exist. And caste system, this whole Hinduism, it stands on three pillars. So one is three pillars. So one is the caste system, the other one is speciesism, and the other one is patriarchy. So this Dalit veganism, they counter all three at once. So again, obviously it counters the use of animals and how we look at animals not as sacred, but they have their own life, they have their own space and everything. And anti-caste movement, which challenges this hierarchical system where there is no up and there is no down, there is no bottom, everyone is equal, and we are fighting for our rights. And also the patriarchal system, because the whole caste system, it depends on the purity of women and how they are bounded by the system, and how they are not allowed to, how they are considered impure, how they are bounded by all the system and control. So Dalit veganism basically fights all of this, and this is why I believe this is the way to liberation of all the three things together. So I think that is the end of the talk. I mean, my PPT. There's one slide, I guess. So thank you, everyone. I mean, I explained sort of things. Uh, some things I've missed. I guess I had to talk about the history, how it started, and how the caste system is right now. So, but I think I've taken a lot more time than I should have. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Pratik. Lou, could you show the last slide of
Yeah.
the PowerPoint?
Yeah. So these are my contact details for Instagram, for Twitter.
So the questions will be, do you know the history of denotified tribes? Do you know anything about them? Also share what you know about indigenous communities in your country. The second question is, guess what kind of relationship animals and Dalit people have in India? Do you have similar cases in your country? And the last question is, what do you think is the state of veganism in India, based on what you see on media, social media, etc.?
So first first and second question I will say, and Stradina will say the last question. So first question, we didn't know what the, sorry, I'm just looking for the question. We didn't know the tribes, but we talked about what indigenous communities we have in our country. So I'm from Japan, and we have Ainu people and Okinawan people or Ryukyuan people. And although Ainu people is recognized as indigenous, Okinawan or Ryukyuan people haven't been recognized as indigenous by the government, even though they have been trying to claim their indigeneity. So they have been obviously getting a lot of discrimination and a lot of burdens from US military bases as well. And going into the second question, guess what kind of relationship animals and Dalit people have? What about in your country? Do you have similar cases in your country? So I don't know what kind of relationship animals and Dalit people have in India, but I was thinking about like hundreds of years ago in Japan when there was a stronger kind of a similar caste system, because Japan is like influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism as well. So like the upper class people are more, majority of them were, doing mostly plant-based diet, and that kind of lifestyle was seen as holy and sacred. But we also had like untouchable kind of people on the bottom of the hierarchy in the society, and those people were kind of given food, or where they were kind of forced to, one of their jobs was to eat the dead animals to clean up the street. So there's obviously kind of oppressive relationship because they're eating the animals, but they're not actively engaged in the speciesism, but rather they're kind of imposed upon the kind of relationship because they're so low in the hierarchy. So I found it really interesting that, the lower caste people are not, they're trying to be oppressive, but they're kind of like put into that like species hierarchy by the upper class. So yeah, that's what we discussed. And the third question, I think Shradina can speak on.
Thank you, Kaho, for sharing that. Let's spotlight Shraddha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. The third question is, what do you think is the state of veganism in India based on what you see on media, social media? I lived in India until I was 2 years old, and since then, my perception has been from media and social media. I think the perception is there is a big community of people who are plant-based, who have not eaten meat, who don't eat meat, but there is a huge focus on dairy products and a huge focus on the health benefits, in quotes, of milk products and dairy products. I mean, Kaho also mentioned a story about how one of her friends from the Indian community had a nutritionist from India who said that it was necessary for them to have dairy products for nutrition. I've had the same comments from my family as well. At the same time, I think veganism in India, from the perspective that I have, is a rejection of all of the values and the culture of that country. So religion, hierarchy, politics, because generally the culture there, as in many other Asian countries, tends to be very hierarchical and conformist. It tends to be a rejection and a rebellion. We also mentioned from Mimi in her country that the umbrella term vegan, vegetarian is generally for people who don't eat meat. And there are people who eat milk and eggs. That was also her perception. And that is our general perception of veganism in India from what we see.
Thank you so much, Shraddha, for sharing that. Okay, going back to room 1, I just want to make sure that, why I didn't miss anyone. Did anyone from room 1 want to share the results? If so, please raise your hand so we can spot you. No. Okay, so room 3, Angel or Fajar, did you want to share the discussion results from your room? Yes, Fajar, thank you.
Okay, hello. I hope I'm audible. So the first question is about the notified community. None of us is aware of what it is and what it means in terms of indigenous people in our respective countries. Joaquin did say that in Uruguay, once the Europeans arrived, they killed the natives, and there's certain native people that remain in his country, but they're more mixed up with the Europeans, so not really pure natives anymore. Angel said that indigenous people, the term indigenous is not really used in China, but there are diverse ethnic groups who maintain their cultures and traditions in different parts of the country. As for Indonesia, obviously it's a big country, it's an archipelago, so there are many ethnic groups and tribes, indigenous people, indigenous communities, and they live in remote areas, or they might mingle with the urbanites as well. And as for the second question, could you for number 2?
Sorry, your connection kind of was a bit bad towards the end. What was the question, Fajar?
Yeah, so for question number 2, thank you, for what kind of relationship animals and Dalit people have. I think we assumed that the relationship is it's not very good, and thank you, and in our respective countries, it's more or less similar. And I think Joaquin pointed out something very interesting, because in the Western world, at least, he's more used to different levels of speciesism, and companion animals, and then probably wild animals, and then farmed animals. So that's for question number 2. And for question number 3.
For room 1. Thank you, Asta.
Thank you, Ellie. So we had Carla from Philippines, Soha from Pakistan, and myself from India in our room. And regarding the first question, Carla shared that she's not really sure about denotified tribes as such in Philippines, but she's aware about indigenous communities that exist in Philippines, because Philippines is composed of several island nations. And I talked about denotified tribes in India because I do not have a very strong idea about the history, and I need to research more on this. But I'm aware of a law which existed, which was drafted in the colonial era, and that law classifies certain communities and certain tribes. And my whatever little understanding I have so far is that these are tribes, like Pratik had earlier mentioned, that migrate from places to places for livelihood, and that has been their way of living. Um, and these such tribes were classified as tribes which have been practicing systematic offenses for years, and they were um, penalized for years because of this colonial law. So that is my understanding of denotified tribes in India. And Soha talked about religious minorities existing in Pakistan, and she mentioned that religious minorities do not have much say, or do not have an identity which is recognized by the government as such in Pakistan. Coming to the second question, since we were short in time, we could not discuss much on this question. Um, from whatever little understanding I have in India is that there's a very strong relationship that exists between Dalit community and animals. And like Pratik also mentioned in the beginning, certain food habits and certain lifestyle choices have been imposed upon certain castes and communities in India by the upper castes. So a lot of things were not in the control, in the hands of those people. So this is what I have to share. And for about the third question, we had a discussion, all three of us had a discussion on how we perceive veganism in India from social media, and how we have seen it and or heard it from people around us from India. So Carla mentioned that in Philippines, she has a lot of colleagues who are from India. And like somebody else had also pointed out earlier, that a lot of people feel that veganism must be very strong in the Hindu culture, because there are a lot of vegetarian people who exist in India. However, uh, my point was that vegetarianism exists in India, and like Pratik mentioned, it exists because of a certain structure and because of a certain religious system that is there in India. However, dairy products are a very um, uh, intrinsic part of Hindu religion, and not a lot of people adhere to veganism because they believe in the idea that veganism is anti-oppressive, and it gives equal rights to all. They adhere to veganism because it has now become a trend, a kind of cultural trend, and an elite trend. It is also associated to your class, and a lot of people are turning towards veganism because of health reasons and because of lifestyle choices. But I also think that activists like Pratik himself and many others have started this discourse of animal rights and veganism, and how veganism as a concept is anti-oppressive in itself. It's not about your lifestyle or health choices, but it's also about your ethical and moral values. And coming to what Soha shared, Soha also shared that her understanding was that vegetarianism, since vegetarianism is so common in India, veganism would also be socially accepted. However, she has some relatives in India, and she knows people in India through whom she has got to know that dairy. Uh, I'm so sorry for referring to Soha as her. Uh, I'm really sorry, Soha, for doing that. They mentioned that they have relatives in India who have helped them understand that dairy is it's a very important part of Hindu culture, and a lot of them do not subscribe to the idea that the dairy industry is oppressive, and it does not. There's no place of animal rights, or there's no talk of animal rights in this discourse. So that is all that I have to share from room one. And we're sorry we forgot to appoint the spokesperson in the beginning.
No worries. Thank you so much, Asta, for being so thorough about the discussion results. Okay, thank you everyone for sharing that. So let's give the floor back to Prateek. Would you like to go on to the next part of your presentation?
Yeah, so I'll start with what Kao had said about the people in Japan. So denotified. Okay, I'll start with the denotified tribes. Asta, what she said about denotified, she's almost right. I mean, whatever she said was absolutely correct. Denotified tribes was actually happened when British people came to India, and that time how we look at colonialism in the West and colonialism in other parts of the world, like in Australia and that place. In India, it functions in a bit different way. Here, the upper class people and upper caste people of India, they actually were sort of very inclined and had a sort of fairly okay sort of relationship. It's not good relationship. Lot of kings and lot of queens in India, they would share gifts and they would give them a lot of presents. They would exchange a lot of presents. They would exchange a lot of dinner nights and a lot of things. I recently went to Banaras, Varanasi, a city in India, very famous, very holistic and everything. It's like everywhere you see the image of India outside the India, they'll definitely show a one shot of Varanasi river side. So there was the king of that city called Vibhuti Narayan Singh, his name was, and I went there, and there is a museum of inside his palace, and it was not in the he was not I mean, it's not that old, in 1800 or 1890s or something. He died recently, like in 2014 he died. So before that, from 1940s to, from 1930s and everything. So his family and British family and Portuguese families, and a lot of royal families, they used to get together. They used to go to hunting together. They used to exchange gift together. They used to get married. I mean, not married exactly. I mean, not married into like races, but they would do all sort of public activities, and they will enjoy indulgence festivities. And looking at them, you will never feel that, oh, this is the form of colonialism that they were practicing here. You will not feel that, okay, Indians were oppressed under colonialism. You will just feel that, oh, these people are like friends together, or these people from different communities are getting together and enjoying themselves together. And this is also one of the main reasons why colonialism existed in our country for a very long time. For like 200 years it existed, because they all the people from higher caste and higher class, they were catering to these the people from Europe. And for people from Europe, they were also fascinated by how lavishly they were living here, how rich they were. Because if you go to this museum, any of this museum, you'll see gold plated bed sheets. You'll see wagons made completely out of silver, and they have this dolly in India. When women are getting women get married in earlier days, there used to be a car like a structure, like a car where men would carry. I think in Japan also it's popular, where people from start and end, they'll hold, and there's some sort of car in between, and they'll carry. So that was completely made out of gold and diamonds, and they will get all the latest cars from America and everything, and they were really rich and super rich. And these people, obviously white people from Europe and America, they were obviously influenced by them, and they also influenced. So this theory that that was very popular at that time, that upper caste Brahmin people and white people, they are cousins of distant era. They both complement each other, and things like that. That's how also Hitler got influenced by Hinduism, and that's how he took that Haken Kreuz, which is exactly the meaning of swastika in German. So that's how influence, and that's how the racial priority. Why I'm explaining all of this is that because these upper caste people and upper class people, they were already there in India, and these tribes and these nomadic tribes and this lower caste people, they were not allowed in the city, and they were not allowed anywhere in the where all these natural habit civilization sort of say were living, where they were outside the civilization. So many of them were forest dwellers, many of them were living near river area or very outskirts, very remote areas, and they would move around and pass around everywhere. So they did not had access to I mean, they had obviously access to land, like how animal species they move seasonal wise, and how people in the, like how elephants they move around different areas. That's very similar way they also would move to different location, different areas. So if they go to some jungle, so they'll have probably go there and have whatever the jungle provides them, or in the river basin, or near the ocean, or near the beach, whatever they provide they will eat. So when British people came in, they started to own these lands and own these all these forests. They started to cut down, and when they started to cut it down, the livelihood of these people, it was severely affected, because they did not know anything else, they did not know where to go and everything. So they started coming to the towns. So when they started coming to the towns, they were not allowed, because obviously first of all, they do not belong to any caste, they are outcast, and they do not do anything that can benefit their civilization. So they were inaccessible, like they were not given any access to the towns. Instead, they were labeled as criminals. And if whatever a crime, whenever a person commits a crime in that, so anything that they did, like obviously when they do not have access to forest, when they do not have access to water, when they do not have access to anything food, they'll obviously go into the town and try to steal them, or try to get it, or try to do some work and get it, and they were not allowed. So they will be forced to do some sort of things. And whenever one person does it, the entire community of that or the entire caste would be labeled as criminals. So this was the pattern that was going. So British people came up with the ideas that, okay, notify all of these tribes, declare them criminals, do not allow them anywhere, or do not allow, whenever you see them, you just take them into prison. And this way, obviously you force them, and you do that, what you say, prediction sort of say, prophecy sort of say, oh, see, these are the tribal people and they are committing crimes. I told you these are criminals. They will obviously go and steal, and they will also do that. So that's how it became. And later, this stayed until 1949, even after independence. 2 years after independence, it stayed. And then government recognized, okay, these notified tribes, they are not criminals. Everyone is not criminal, and we should not treat them like that, and we should get away with this law. They got away with this law, but then again they I mean, for the namesake, they got away. Now they changed that law to habitual offenders. So these notified tribes, they got the name from notified to denotified, but all the similar things that was there in the rule, it still exists, and now they're called habitual offenders. And this habitual offenders is used on not just tribes, communities, but also on many people, but basically on tribes. So if a person is coming from a certain community, certain caste, they'll see which caste they come from, they'll see which class they come from, or which tribes they come from, and they'll consider them habitual offenders. And under habitual offenders, police or anything inquiry that happens, they can just go and do the inquiry. They can just search their house, they can just enter their house, or do whatever they want in the name of inquiry. So this is what the denotified tribe is. So sort of very similar to what Kaho said, sort of very similar to what Walken had said, that when people they came, white people, they came outside, and they started to, they grabbed the land and they started killing people. It's just that here the killing was not that severe, but they made them criminal because the ruling class of India was also favoring the white people. So it was a mixture of all of that, and that's how it happens. And the second question was that the state of the people, the relationship between animals and Dalit people. It is also very similar to what some of the people here have said. I think Kaholi explained that how the veganism, how the people from lower caste, they were forced upon certain lifestyle and certain food choices. So they had to rely on, they had to do some sort of oppressive things to animals in order to survive. So basically it's that. But it also here, the people from our community, the marginalized community, Dalit people and Adivasi people, they are not just dependent on the livelihood that oppresses animals, but also they have a kind of a relationship that other people, other communities do not have, like Savannah or upper caste people do not have, because we're close to animals. We deal with them all the day, all the time. We go there, we wash them, we clean them. When they're dead, we brought them here and we bury them. We take out their skin, we take out their flesh, and we basically, from taking care to killing them and everything, we are involved. And a lot of times the emotional bonding that happens between people, animal people and us, we have a better and far better understanding of how animals are, how we take care of them, and how the spaces that we have. I'd argue that we have a better understanding and better relationship with the animals, even though a lot of things that we do are oppressive in nature. But it's not that we want to do that, but it's actually kind of forced. And many people in our community do not realize that it is actually forced, and they see in a different lens. That's basically because how it has been through generations and generations after generations, that it has happened, that we were forced, and now we see is that our right. And if somebody tells us to not eat animals or not do something to animals, then we become defensive, and we think that, okay, this is part of our this is our right, and we want to do the same thing and everything. So that is one thing. And the last part was how the veganism is perceived in India. So I think I forgot who said that, but I think the veganism in India is perceived from that lens. I forgot actually what was there. I'll just present my view here. So the veganism in India is very heavily dominated by the upper caste people and Savannah people, obviously. And yeah, I think it was Astha who said that the veganism here, we do not think of it as animal rights, but sort of how from religious perspective. So I'll go about a little bit the history about how the vegetarianism in India grew up and how it became what it is today. So earlier in India, if you read the Vedic, all the Vedas and everything, like there are 4 Vedas and all the religious texts, it talks about how to kill animals. It talks about how to eat animals. It also talks about animal sacrifices. It talks about everything that currently people oppose and see as a purity and perspective. So purity and perspective. So earlier it was people in India were not vegetarians. They were never vegetarians, and they were never vegans. A lot of vegans in India, they claim that veganism was born in India, but veganism was not born in India. Even the Buddhism, when it came, when it talks about animal rights, when it talked about treating animals in a kinder way, or animals, when they banned animal sacrifice, they also did not talk about veganism. They talk about vegetarianism. They did not talk about veganism. So how did the transition happen from that time, from really heavy meat eating society like Brahmins, and everybody ate meat and everybody consumed animal products, to shifting to this purity form of structure? So there is this yagna. There are a lot of yagyas happen in communities. Basically, I don't know how to explain it in English, where they sit around a fire and they do some sort of religious mantras, and then all sort of things that happen. That is basically how yagya I can explain. And so there is this I forgot the name, but it's a horse related Ashwamedh Yagya, something like that. I think Ashwamedh Yagya, the exact proper term of it is. So here the king of kingdom, he conducts this yagya, and he leaves that horse at the end of the yagya. When yagya finishes, he releases a horse in the yagya, and that horse is left to roam around in the kingdom. And wherever he goes to, wherever area he goes to, whatever area he covers, and to any area, that area till the area where the horse has traveled becomes the part of his kingdom. if anybody has to challenge that king, he has to kill that horse. If that horse doesn't die and return back, then the king would kill him and consume his meat. And this is written in the Vedas, Hindu scriptures. It is written in the Hindu scriptures. So obviously animal sacrifice and everything. So they were never vegetarians. So how did they turn to vegetarian? When the Buddhism came in, because Buddhism was anti-caste and Buddhism was anti-oppressive, and in Buddhism the teaching was everybody is equal and everybody has space and everybody should be treated nicely. And during the time of Ashoka, this Buddhism just started, like it spread like wildfire everywhere, because he was the king and he adopted Buddhism, and then he spread it. He has a means to spread it everywhere. Like he sent the monks to other parts of Asia and everywhere. So this teaching became very huge, and Hinduism sort of at the time almost disappeared. It was it became a minority at that time. And when, so at the Ashoka was the king of Mauryan Empire. So last Mauryan ruler, who was Brihadatta II, he was killed by a Brahmin warrior, and he overtook the kingdom, and he named it as a Shunga Empire. And during Shunga Empire, he tried to reestablish the Hinduism, and that's when he changed a lot of things. That's when he changed a lot of practices and a lot of treatments and everything. So that's why we have like two Vedic eras. There are early Vedic eras and there are later Vedic eras. So during Shunga Empire, later Vedic era was written, and here he redefined caste system. He redefined how to eat and what to eat, and which committee gets to access music, which committee gets to dance in certain forms, and every sort of things like that. So that's how the vegetarianism became an eccentric part of Hindu culture. But it was not because they loved animals. It was because in order to shame and in order to put themselves in a better light to the public at that time, to influence the people to come back to Hinduism. That's how it did. And they also, while doing this, they also made strong the caste system. So whenever Shunga king, he would go anywhere to capture or to fight, so all the prisoners or all the people he captured during the war, they will be converted to different caste, like lower caste, and whoever he'll consider the warriors or something like that, or he find, he'll give them different caste. And that's how he try to redefine the caste. And also many of the religious god that we see, that we have 33 crore god that we say, Hindus that we say, they are actually, many of them are actually local gods, local tribal people's gods, like how we have in Central America, how we had in North America and South America, like a lot of tribes that had their own god, their own way of worshipping the people. Here, when Shunga he went, he actually claimed that these gods are actually my gods. So you come to our religion and you become part of Hinduism. And then he tried to oppress them. Then he made then a hierarchy here, that, oh, this god belongs to this god and this god is a reincarnation of that god. And so how this connection becomes like that. So that's how Hindus have 33 crore gods. So this is how vegetarian was part of it. I think I could not explain it entirely, but I think I've run out of time.
Thank you so much, Pratik, for that. Okay, so let's move on to the Q&A for the next 10 minutes. Okay, so let's start with a question from Kaho. This is quite a big question though, so if you could be quite quick and concise, that'd be great. How much are people in India aware of this caste system? Do they simply accept their caste, or is there a movement that resists it and attempts to liberate themselves from the caste?
Could you post this in the chat, or?
Yes, I'll do that right now.
How much are people in India aware of the caste? Do they simply accept their caste? Oh, there is a big movement. Like there is a really, really huge movement that is happening in India, but we do not get the space because the space is occupied by Brahmins, space is occupied by upper caste people. They have the media, they have the means to control. You'll think that, okay, social media is a micro blogging platform, we'll get to speak about something, but they're also they are dominated, because Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, these are okay tech, these are softwares, these are applications, but who designs these applications, who makes them these applications, who works on these applications? And algorithms, when they say, okay, this is algorithm based, but where do that algorithm gets the data to work? Where does the data comes from that feeds that algorithm? So there is a really big movement that goes on during, I mean, December 6th is the date when Baba Saheb Ambedkar died. So I think I do not have the time, that much time to explain, because he is really seen as the liberator of our community, and he actually did a lot of things for us, not just for us, but also for women, and also for India as a whole. I mean, if I just start speaking about it, it'll just take another hour. So you'll just see. So on December 6th, he died. He died on December 6th, 1955, I guess. 1955, 1956 something. So that is one of the biggest event that happens here in Mumbai. Like millions of people come here and they gather here in Mumbai to celebrate that day as a day of also, I mean, it's sort of a festival where people actually come and, pay tributes to him, and it's really for weeks and weeks, people here just stay here and then they celebrate. So it's a very big movement that happens. He did Satyagraha, Mahad Satyagraha he did on March 27. So that was the Satyagraha is basically we were not allowed to drink water from wells. We were not allowed to draw water from wells or touch anything from wells. So what he did was he created a big movement. He gathered lots of people, very like thousands and thousands of people, and he walked to that Mahad area, that pond, and he drew water from that pond, from that well, just to point as a form of protest, because we were not allowed to have water, we were not allowed to touch water. So he actually went there and he touched the water, he drew the water from there and drank that water and used that water to wash his hands, basically in terms of Brahmins making it impure. So after that, what Brahmins did that they went there to near that pond and they did all sort of puja and all sort of apologies to gods and everything to purify that water again. And when they were finished with that thing, Ambedkar again went there with a lot of people and again drew the water from there and again impurified that water. And he did that, he continuously kept doing that until they gave up. And it was in 1927. So it was, at that time it was a big moment. Even still today it's very big moment. The Bhima Koregaon that happened, it's still a very big moment. We are like really huge in number and we really do a very strong protest whenever happen. You can just say anything, I mean, you can say whatever thing you want inside your room, but you can't make casteist comment in a media, because we'll be making noise. But obviously it's media is controlled by them people, so they don't pay attention, but they are like, they know that we exist and we do, and people are aware of their caste. Everybody is aware of their caste. It's just the Savarna people do not speak about their caste. They say that, okay, caste is a thing of the past. Why is the thing of the past? Because it doesn't affect them, so it's the thing of the past. So they look at it as a very shameful thing that British people had come and did it, but it was actually, as you know, obviously it's a very old custom.
Thank you so much, Pratik. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today for the questions. I'm so sorry that we couldn't get back to all the questions, but thank you so much for submitting them. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Pratik. And if anyone wants to help Pratik, please consider donating him. There's the information again on in chat. Thank you, Mimi. So please consider donating to Pratik.
I'll just take 1 minute to answer the walk-ins question. If plant-based
Sure.
foods. So if plant-based food is seen as more pure, do lower caste people are allowed to eat it? Actually, we do not have access to a lot of dairy products. Many Dalit communities do not have access to dairy products because they are costly. Milk is costly, ghee is costly. Ghee is basically refined. You can just search. I mean, there's no time. Ghee is costly, butter is costly, and anything that is derived from dairy is very costly. So we are not, we can't. Many of the Dalit communities, they can't afford to have dairy products. They can't afford to have meat. So they are naturally dependent on plant-based diet only. But there is two problem. First of all, the meat and dairy products, they are seen as an item of luxury. So when they are seen as an item of luxury, you telling them not to eat meat and telling them not to eat dairy products, it's seen as very class oppressive thing. Like how you can drive, like how you've been driving car for a very long time. Now you're driving bicycle, but the person who is already driving a bicycle, he wants to have a car. So you're telling them, oh, don't drive car, drive bicycle, because it's good for environment, good for this and that. So it's seen as in that way. So that's why many people see meat and flesh and dairy products as a matter of their rights and part of their rights. So they do have, most of the time they eat plant-based food only, but then they see this as in this sense, is from this lens.
So thank you again, Pratik, for your insightful talk today. And we had a really good chance to reflect back on our own communities and our countries as well. So that was very, very good session for everyone. Thank you so much. Let's give Pratik a final round of jazz hands. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.